Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. We are on episode 3 of our philosophical review of what History Comes Alive is supposed to be all about. We are about to begin the English colonial development of the northern colonies, New England, and I wanted to take a few weeks to work through what our intended goals are here and how we're approaching them. We're growing and changing a few things up about the podcast anyway, so it seemed like a good place to do this. The two main goals of the podcast are, 1, how the English colonies developed in today's United States of America, how they managed to unite against the English, and 2, what role the native population, and there were a lot of competing groups, played, all the while critically working through and assessing the information available. This is not intended to be an exercise in trivia, but actually understanding. We started a little over a year ago with several episodes covering European history through the 16th century. There were a lot of changes. Distilling them down for our purposes today, we can say the growth of modern nationalism is rooted in this time. The controversies that arose were carried over into the New World. So far, we developed the primary English colonies in the New England area. We met many of the native tribes and key leaders. We watched as the English slowly gained momentum after their initial foothold and culminated with the Pequot War, which really marginalized the natives and accelerated English dominance. And that's where we'll pick up in just a few weeks. That accelerated English dominance. What's coming are all the controversies that followed, the various European conflicts that jumped across the Atlantic, the English Civil War, the development and collapse of the wampum economy. And then there's the problem with the French. So the last 2 weeks, as well as this week, are meant to be a refresher as to what we're driving toward, more of my philosophical approach than anything else. So with that, we want to build on the concepts that we've previously discussed. The role of government, not just conceptually, but inside the confines of the Constitutional Republic of the United States of America. What's the role of the U.S. government? We want to understand that then through the lens of those who have made and shaped our history. We began to develop the difference between the trivial, things that may be familiar with no depth of understanding, the kind of empty believism, versus really knowing and understanding something, being pregnant with data to support a well-considered view on any particular subject. And all that's tied to the question, who framed or frames your argument? Where do you get your beliefs from? Who frames your doctrine? I mean, the saying really is true. If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice, right? So too, if you have an opinion, it's been shaped by someone or some philosophy. Then we recognized, through the allegory of the cave by Socrates, that we can have a strong aversion to new information, especially if it challenges our worldview. There's a danger of filtering information if it's simply to filter out and sanitize or defend a current position. There's a liberty found in knowledge, understanding, application. It can give us peace of mind. And frankly, in my opinion, peace of mind is actually the most valuable possession we can have. We can become so comfortable, suffering no real consequences for our positions, that we forget or may never learn how precious a commodity confidence from preparation really is. Ideas have consequences. We understand this in the physical world. I mean, if we hit our thumb with a hammer, we immediately are confronted with the reality of pain that can come through our own actions. We learn as quickly as possible how to avoid that pain. We're not so quick to understand this in the metaphysical world. Everybody's opinion is not equal. Some things are predictable, and their results evidenced by what has happened before. We can't see the wind, but we see and feel and experience the wind. We see its effects. It's there no matter we see it or not. In a lot of ways, such are the events and lessons of history. We can see the effects of events we did not experience, and there are lessons to be learned from those effects. So again, What's the role of government as it impacts and shapes the interests of men, as it provokes them to action? What do you really know about American history? How do you know? More aptly, I guess we could ask. How do you apply what you know? How do you use what you know to process new information when it comes in? Do your decisions confirm your wisdom or expose your ignorance to history? Is your knowledge nothing more than robotic regurgitation, words that someone else said, pre-digested thoughts? Is it emotionless and sterile? You can know a lot about something and have no passion, no intimacy, no fidelity with the facts whatsoever. The focus of my question today is the concept of fidelity, faithfulness. It's a concept I spend a lot of time working through in my own mind, the concept of fidelity to an ideal or to a principle. When we think about fidelity, it's really the concept of being sold out for a cause or a purpose, to the point of personal loss if need be. Most of us lack this in most areas. I mean, frankly, most things aren't really worthy of fidelity. Who cares what kind of peaches you buy, in all honesty? To me, the concept of fidelity, constructively, is to answer the question, which hill or hills are worth dying on? When push comes to shove, what will you fight for? I got to tell you, if there's too many answers coming to your mind, you misunderstand the concept. Fidelity comes through intimacy. You can't be that intimate with that many things. Without intimacy toward a particular subject or topic, if we can use a human analogy, you're more likely to experience lust than love, something fleeting rather than timeless. You're experiencing something more akin to infatuation than fidelity. These positions can look the same, love and lust, something fleeting and something permanent. But one renders you weak in times of crisis, and the other emboldens and strengthens. The older I get, the more my fidelity is to actual knowledge, real things, not hypocrisy, not trivia. It lends credence to those we recognize as experts who warn, or correct, admirers by telling them they don't have all the answers. I mean, sometimes that may be false humility, but other times it may be the wisdom to know that things are complicated, that even an expert does not have all the answers. We're usually on autopilot. I mean, most things that we experience require nothing more than being on autopilot, in all honesty. We live trivial lives. A good example for most of us is our jobs or our careers. I mean, once we've become well-trained and competent, the place that we spend most of our time and attention, it just becomes rote resuscitation. The difference is that for most of us, how we carry out our job has little impact on most others in society. Our understanding and application of history, however, does have an impact. Can you walk through a series of events and realize their relationships, their interdependence? Think about a puzzle, a 1,000-piece puzzle. Imagine that 1,000-piece puzzle scattered on the floor, scattered in pieces. Now imagine that same 1,000-piece puzzle assembled and orderly. It's the same puzzle either way, assembled or in pieces, orderly or chaotic. Are you able to look at the pieces and make sense of the bigger picture, the more complete picture? How much more valuable is the larger picture than the individual pieces? History is like a puzzle. It's best understood when we have assembled as many of the pieces as possible. Let's add to that line of reasoning a little bit. Is it more useful to know all the pieces, specific names, dates, places of history, or the concepts? Because concepts are not situationally exclusive. Concepts can be applied over and over again to generate predictable results. Let's build on that concept. Let's develop it and make sure that we're on the same page. Because again, this is a reintroduction to the podcast. I won't constantly be explaining how to think or my thought process necessarily. Let's think about this with some common examples. Before we talk about a particular historical example for us today, to really draw this illustration out, let's talk about a basic human function, a universal function, learning to walk. It's a matter of mechanics, balance, coordination, muscular ability, coupled with the desire to move independently. Once the mechanics are mastered, walking becomes very utilitarian. So the benefit, the utility of walking is not the mechanics, but the mobility that it affords. Do you understand that? So couple that idea, mechanics versus utility, with the idea of intentionally applying, repeating, duplicating an activity or a strategy over and over to obtain similar results. A good example of this can be found in an illustration of football, American football. I mean, it's football season, so we might as well talk American football, right? A good football coach is generally successful again and again if they're allowed to operate without front office and administrative interference. A good coach appears to be able to duplicate success over and over, in spite of changing talent levels, trades, injuries, personalities. The players don't make the coach. Obviously, there's got to be a chemistry factor as well. There's got to be key players, I get it. But the coach sets the tone. The culture is driven by the coach. Good coaches are able to get more out of their squads than their counterparts. The mechanics of their program must be sound, and their players must turn mechanics into utility. In this case, the mechanics are the fundamentals, and the utility is the victory that comes from employing those fundamentals. Some coaches are better than others at grooming this environment. They seem to do two things. They execute what they do well, and they take away their opponent's strength. Leaning on a phrase that we've used several times throughout this podcast series, good coaches frame the argument better than their opponents, don't they? They will force the other team to play the game they want them to, and they don't allow the other team to play the game they'd prefer to play. That's not an easy task to achieve. It requires honesty a lot of times, self-reflection. It's the ability to recognize the difference between what you want to do with your team as opposed to what you can do. Then being able to sell the plan to the support staff, the coaches, the players. The various special teams coaches are experts in specific areas, but the head coach alone is tasked with coordinating the pieces into a larger, cohesive unit, something extraordinary. Not all coaches are good at this. I mean, not all smart guys are good leaders, and not all good leaders are necessarily smart outside of their respective craft. It's the concepts that are emphasized, the strategy itself, the fundamentals of the coach's mindset, the various moving parts that work together to make the whole thing better, like the various pieces to a puzzle, or the difference between the mechanics of walking and the utility of mobility. This model can be duplicated over a variety of life's activities: family, social, civil, the exercise of military operations or politics, business strategy, even our approach to understanding history. Like Plato's allegory of the cave, and for those of you that might have missed it, we talked about Plato's allegory last week. This is not just a random reference that I expected everybody to be familiar with. At any rate, like Plato's allegory of the cave, the message is bigger than the men trapped in the cave. The takeaway transcends the individual. The takeaway transcends generation. The takeaway transcends culture. The takeaway transcends society. Situations are unique, but concepts can be almost universally understood. They have the power to affect change. Oftentimes, it's only those that have experienced something beyond the popular, something extraordinary, that really have the courage to stand against the current. It's those that have experienced the extraordinary that make history. And I want to know what that was when I'm reading about the men or women or events of history. Back in school, I always loved history. They called it social studies back then. I think it's called global or something now. I loved literature too. Don't misunderstand me, not English and grammar. And you can tell by the way I use English and grammar, I probably should have paid more attention. But I loved literature because literature, good literature, is, to me, the recorded observations and expressions of others, captured in their own words, from their perspective, from their time and place in history. It's fascinating. It's a little like voyeurism, but in a good way. Anyway, these two subjects, social studies and literature, largely existed like two parallel tracks running side by side, but never merging, never intersecting. Until I read some of the great literature of the 19th century, the reality of human nature, the existentialists primarily, the frailty, the depravity, self-serving, self-glorifying nature of man, mingled with the beauty, the courage, the resiliency of the human spirit. Dostoevsky's Idiot, the universal nature of man, Kafka's graphic ugliness of said nature, and Camus' subtlety of the graphic ugliness and universal nature of man. Even in a child, we teach them not to steal because they are by nature self-serving. We all are. It's the same idea that we talked about. We as people generally, if kept comfortable enough, will forego what we want with what we have based on the level of consequence. Then there was Nathaniel Hawthorne's expositions over and over and over again about hypocrisy. I think it was Samuel Clemens that said, "Nothing so needs reforming as other people's habits." Anyways, it was through these men, their observations, collective voices, that the concepts of human nature and history collided. And these really are fundamentally universal traits. I mean, look at the guys that I just mentioned. From Dostoevsky living in Russia, and Kafka was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in its final days, and Camus, a part of the French resistance. Hawthorne, the angry third-generation Puritan in New England, as he observed those things. And Samuel Clemens, the author of Tom Sawyer. So you get a real mix of guys that are recognizing human nature from the worlds that they lived in, very different worlds, by the way. And so it was through these men, their observations, their collective voices, that the concepts of human nature and history collided. And the people of the history books, the stories I'd read, came alive. History, as I read it, is the combination of human nature and human actions, a collision of will and opportunity. Intentional history makers are those among us willing to forsake everything, comfort, reputation, standing for what they believe. In them, we witness firsthand the collision of will and opportunity. Collisions so big they change the status quo. They make even Washington's grazing multitude pay attention. These collisions have the capacity to move entire nations, to change the course of history. Although we may go decades, generations without witnessing men of this caliber, the closing decades of colonial America was home to hundreds of this rare breed, if not thousands. The birth of the United States of America is one of the most exciting, transformational, and improbable experiments in societal history. The concepts that the government exists for the good of the people, the concept that the government exists for the good of the people, for their benefit, when practically applied. You understand that? There's a concept at play that has to be practically applied. I realize and have mentioned there are legitimate questions about the founders' motives, and we'll look at those in due time. But the results, the accomplishments, speak for themselves. At the conclusion of the American Revolution, those living in the former 13 American colonies were not recognized as subjects, but citizens. And that's a very interesting debate. What does it mean to be a citizen, a good citizen? Self-determined, autonomous, responsible, obedient, loyal, lawful? I mean, imagine asking that question, considering that question back then in a world dominated by monarchies and autocrats and dictators, men and women who ruled largely unchecked. It should go without saying, but the human rights movements and controversies around topics of slavery and suffrage will be addressed as they chronologically happened. Neither the founders nor successive generations, including our own, have fully figured some of this out. And I think some of the criticisms of the American system is fair, and some is not when compared to other societies. But again, we're going to address those issues as we come to them in our narrative. Those are big issues. The culmination of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Age of Enlightenment produced two related, bold new concepts. The first one is the importance and the value of the individual. And secondly, representative government on a grand scale. What does that even mean? How can we understand that question in context from within today's society, centuries after the fact? I mean, we were born into this society. We have no other point of reference. It's tough to imagine how radical a concept that was, and still is in so many places around the world. No matter your specific views, the concepts of self-determination and representative government should make you breathe deep. Granting liberty, a large measure of self-determination to the masses, was and still is a bold move. Consider what that really means. Think about this. I mean, listen, this is important. is a couple of questions. The first one is, what are you expecting to receive from your neighbor? And the second question then is, what are you willing to grant in return under our social contract? I mean, you and your neighbor are allowed, you're permitted to believe contrary to one another without fear of reprisal. It's not that way in many parts of the world. So here's another question. Do you believe we still, as a culture, believe in individual liberty as the founders and subsequent generations understood it? I mean, think about it. Think about the society that we live in today, what's going on all around us. Be honest. Do you believe as a culture we still believe in individual liberty? We hear people talk about it all of the time. Oftentimes, those talking the loudest about individual liberty are trying to take the other side's liberty away. That's just my observation anyways. But the question could be rephrased. Should we still believe in individual liberty as the founders and subsequent generations understood it? What are the alternatives to that? Be careful when you answer that. Don't answer it with just a pre-digested, siloed, single issue answer. I'm asking about the puzzle that has 1,000 pieces that's already been assembled. So when we answer that question, we don't want to think about individual pieces of that puzzle. I didn't say that the system was or is perfect. I asked if the template was still relative or has the experiment run its course. What's the reasonable alternative? Because the system we have can be changed. I mean, it's evolved since its inception. Like Plato, there are many men who can help to shape our views about the nature of man in general, about societal conduct specifically. They can offer challenges to what we take for granted, what we live with, what we accept as normal and rational. There are those rare folks who do not leave their loyal audiences amused, but changed and different. These are the people that I love to explore, the people that I want to talk about. There's a compelling story of a young man of 22 years old that really highlights the concept of how I approach history to understand, to learn, and to apply it, and also kind of brings to the surface all the things we've been talking about today. So imagine the place was New Orleans in its early 19th century, and the scene is a slave auction. Imagine witnessing the scene as described by historian Paul Johnson. I'm picking up somewhere in the middle of the narrative here. It's kind of extensive, so be patient, but I want to just read this quote from Paul Johnson that brings out the emotional sentiment of the time, of their time, not of ours. Paul Johnson wrote this, quote, "All Northerners knew or believed that male slave owners slept with their pretty female slaves and often bought them with this in mind. One young man, aged 22, and on his second trip to New Orleans, saw a young and beautiful teenage black girl, guaranteed a virgin, being sold. The leering auctioneer declaring, quote, 'The gentleman who buys her will get good value for his money,' end quote. The girl was virtually naked, and the horrific scene made a deep impression on the young man. Southerners denied they fornicated with their female slaves, but they also, contradicting themselves, accused their northern tormentors of sexual envy, which may have been true in some cases," end quote. Think about the reality of that culture. Never mind the social or political, the doctrinal debates, states' rights, and centralized governments. Think about the reality of that culture, witnessing the horrific concept of a slave auction under those parameters. I mean, do you have female relatives? Do you care about any of the women in your life? When you think about this in terms of they could have been one of those young ladies? Further developing the scene, and the 22-year-old witness a little bit more, another historian, David Herbert Donald, spoke of the young man's personal temperament. How he was described by those who knew him best. Again, not from hundreds of years later, but from the people that were there that knew him. That's the best way to get this information oftentimes. He was said to have had, quote, "a distrust of intimacy and an unwillingness to confide in others. He was self-assured." That sounds like kind of a cold personality, doesn't it? He had a distrust of intimacy and an unwillingness to confide in others. It was also said that he possessed, quote, "a reliance on his own abilities that made it almost impossible to bend and seek help from others whom he knew to be his intellectual inferiors." It sounds kind of arrogant. Again, this guy's temperament was, quote, a reliance on his own abilities that made it almost impossible to bend and seek help from others whom he knew to be his intellectual inferiors. So we see that he's got kind of a cold personality, and he's also kind of arrogant. This man had a secretary who said one time, quote, it's absurd to call him a modest man, end quote. And he continued by saying, quote, no great man was ever modest. It was his intellectual arrogance and unconscious assumption of superiority that some men never could forgive, end quote. That's quite a description, again, from David Herbert Donald. Quote, it's certain that on some basic issues, no advice from any friend, no suggestions from experience would have altered his policies, end quote. And lastly, from this man's wife, she said, quote, a terribly firm man when he set his foot down. None of us, no man, no woman could rule him after he had made up his mind, end quote. So we've got a guy that's got kind of a cold personality. He's arrogant. He is stubborn. He doesn't talk to people he feels are inferior to him. And even his own wife says that he was terribly firm and nobody could change his mind once he fixed it. This same man's life was marked by many failures. Business failures, political failures. The experience in New Orleans stayed with this young man all of his life. To him, it was more than a prick of the conscience, more than a conviction. It was a moral indignation. There's an old country song by Aaron Tippin with these lyrics, if you'll indulge me, because I think it presses our point here. Now, I got to tell you, I'm an old-time country guy. Almost every podcast episode that I've done has some, country song affiliated with it in my own mind. I'm into the lyrics, the real country that went beyond the trucks and the hunting dogs and cheating on your girlfriend or whatever flavor of degrade you like to attach to country music. It spoke of the human experience, good and bad. It spoke of damnation and redemption from a social, romantic, spiritual standpoint. It created an image of nostalgia that, by and large, never actually existed, but in the hearts and the minds of the existentialists among us. Anyway, the lyrics are these, and I'll spare you my singing voice, but I'll read you the lyrics. This is a song by Aaron Tippin. It goes like this, quote, now Daddy didn't like trouble, but if it came along, everyone that knew him knew which side that he'd be on. He never was a hero or this county's shining light, but you could always find him standing up for what he thought was right. He'd say, you've got to stand for something or you'll fall for anything. You've got to be your own man, not a puppet on a string. Never compromise what's right and uphold your family name. You've got to stand for something or you'll fall for anything. And he continues, now we might have been better off or owned a bigger house if Daddy'd done more giving in or a little more backing down. But we always had plenty, just living his advice. Whatever you do today, you'll have to live with tonight. End quote. These lyrics draw such a common man's example of integrity and a strong moral compass. Honesty, courage, bravery. That's easy speech that sometimes must be backed up by action. Do we live this way? What do you believe? What are your principles in your core? I mean, to what extent, to what lengths, at what cost will you stand for what you believe is right? How much do you really understand about those principles that you claim? Are they lust or love? Are they fleeting passions or will they hold you captive for a lifetime? These days, oftentimes, many men appear to be men without chests. They're shallow and without conviction, ruled by the emotion of the day, perhaps more aptly the spirit of the day, the zeitgeist, indecent, so caught up in their own pleasures and sense of entitlement, whatever that may be, they can either no longer be trusted to do the right thing, or worse, they will not. They have not been inspired to do so. Bicker, yes. Throw stones, yes. Critically work through an issue and take a stand for what's right? No, not on your life. If you're listening to this and have even a hint, a monicum of a clue as to what's going on in our society right now today in 2021, you know that this is true. Men who make history live the lyrics that we just read. They stand for something. They suffer loss if need be. They may not uphold their family's name. I mean, there's just as many determined scoundrels as heroes. That's why it's so imperative for people to work through the issues for themselves. Careful consideration of an issue may not change your view, but it can sometimes allow you to understand the other side and also, at the same time, be firmer in your own convictions. I'm not making a judgment call in any particular position. I'm talking about the absolute dedication men who are true change agents demonstrate to achieve their goals. Particular character traits, pros or cons, of the individual and their connotations can matter very little in the hindsight of history. Do you agree with that? Particular character traits, whether good or bad, of the individual and their connotations can matter little in the hindsight of history? Let me ask you a question. Would you be more inclined to follow a rumored womanizer, a known drunk, or a strong leader known to practice fidelity to one woman and who abstains from alcohol? Put this another way, would you be inclined to follow Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, or Adolf Hitler? FDR was a rumored womanizer, Churchill drank, and Hitler was not known to do either. I do realize there were drugs in the end, but that's a broader conversation. In the end, the character flaws or strengths matter very little with these three men, don't they? Name a real change agent who was not plagued with certain flaws or predispositions, just like every one of us. Many times their flaws are noted by their contemporaries only to be ignored later, after they have achieved their goal and immortality. Well, the experience of the young man in New Orleans who witnessed the reality of the slave auction firsthand set in motion a determination to act. He stood for something. He was prepared to sacrifice a bigger house when the opportunity came along. With all of his noted character flaws, with a lifetime of failures and disappointments, he acted on his convictions. And as you might have guessed, that young man was Abraham Lincoln. Headstrong and stubborn, deliberate and unreasonable, dedicated and goal-oriented, arrogant, would not listen to an inferior person's advice. Abraham Lincoln was no man's puppet. Those same noted, traditionally negative personality traits seem positive in hindsight, don't they? Excusable in the man. Those past failures, and there were many, built an endurance and a courage in the face of opposition that few men or women ever achieve. Abraham Lincoln stood for something. He exercised fidelity to a concept, steadfast and devoted. He risked it all. It cost him everything. He forever changed the world. Look at the impact that auction had for all of us. The undeniable conviction that it produced. The action when opportunity presented itself. It split families and whole communities. It nearly split our nation in half. Well, I think that story is very inspiring, and it's more compelling the more you know. All of history is. You see, in Lincoln, we recognize specific things. Abraham Lincoln illustrates the perfect combination of experience and will. The collision of conviction and opportunity. That collision did not just move a nation, it changed the course of human history. His story inspires because it registers on a deeper level. The human experience, the common human experience, is so similar. We may not be heroes or our county's shining light, but we're all molded and shaped by our personal experiences. We're inspired by men like Abraham Lincoln because in him we find the motivation and the courage to stand for our values, even when crisis comes. To be inspired, to be really inspired, to have courage and conviction, we must learn from others. The more we know, the less likely we are to be someone's puppet on a string. We can exercise our own self-determination with a little more confidence. As we work through the next century and a half of English colonialism in North America, primarily the current United States of America, these are the kinds of storylines that we want to draw out. Those that are memorable, relatable, applicable to our own lives, to the times that we live in. So be sure to join us next time as we look at another chapter of colonial America in an attempt to make the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.